This is the hidden history of tequila's survival, the vision of a man named Cuervo, yes, he's real, his fierce rivalry with a family named Sauzas, and the unlikely pact that saved them all. It's the story of one of the most important eras of Mexican history before, during, and after the revolution that's been lost, much of it deliberately. Through political chaos and family dynasties, strong women worked both behind the scenes and on the main stage to keep their families and the industry alive. And today we speak with the man who spent 12 years uncovering all of this hidden history. Vámonos, friend. Normally I stand in front of a camera and tell a story. This time we'll get the story from a man who's literally written the book on a subject that is near and dear to my heart and the hearts of Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Latinos, Hispanics, and people all over the world who enjoy a nice tequila. But there's a story behind how that drink came to be. My guest is Ted Genoways, a two-time James Beard Award-winning journalist and the author of Tequila Wars, José Cuervo, and the Bl00dy Struggle for the Spirit of Mexico. Ted's written the story behind the Cuervo dynasty and others, how they survived exile, backroom deals, betrayals, and a country in absolute chaos. And somehow they came out on top. So pour yourself something smooth. Salud. And let's get into it. Ted, bienvenido. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
So here's where I'm coming from. I've been a lifelong tequila drinker since I was maybe 18 or 19. I figure I know the difference between a blanco, a reposado, añejo. I've had the good fortune to be to a couple of distilleries, La Rojeña, Amatitan with Herradura, talked to some folks very much on the surface and seen a little bit of the process of them pulling off the agave leaves and then seeing a little bit of the artisanal production of tequila. But my knowledge is really about the product, and the version of history that I have is just that the whole thing started with pulque, the sacred fermented sap of the maguey. And then the Spanish arrived, brought distillation, started cooking this sap into something they called vino de mezcal. And then in like the 1700s, a man named José Antonio de Cuervo, the Crow, got permission from Spain to produce and sell this mezcal wine commercially. And then over time, through generations of Cuervo innovation, Mexican pride and demand and marketing, we have the tequila that we drink today. What am I missing, Ted?
Well, I mean, you're not getting anything wrong, right? And that's true. That this is the story that I heard when I first started traveling to the tequila region as well. And it's a compelling story, and it is true. I mean, in the Cuervo family, they're central to that story of tequila going from being, as you said, one of the regional mezcals to being the spirit that we think of as being sort of indicative of the national identity now. That was the Cuervos. And as you mentioned, there were some other families as well. The Sauzas family in particular is sort of notable as a rival in the town of Tequila. But this story is one, and what appealed to me right from the beginning, it is one of this sort of generational tradition of tequila making. And to me, there's something sort of magical about being able to go to a distillery that's been there since it was built by Vicente Rojas, who called it La Rojeña, named it for himself, but he was married to Maria Magdalena Cuervo. And so this was a Cuervo family distillery from the beginning. And, more than 200 years later, the distillery is still there. It's still a family-owned business. And it would seem that there's a sort of simplicity to the story, that there's a kind of linear tale of a single family, setting up business and continuing to grow over the years. The reality is much more complicated, of course. It is really a story of, as you mentioned, this tremendous chaos that Mexico went through, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century. and how the Cuervo family survived all of that and really came out as the leader in the industry. And the way that that happened was through the sort of ingenuity and skill as a businessman of José Cuervo Labastida, the person who we know simply as José Cuervo, because he was the one to put his name on the bottles, to start the bottling in the first place, but then to put his name onto the bottles. And so he is the name that is kind of synonymous with the tequila industry these days. And yet, what I discovered when I started asking more particular questions of people, even in the town of Tequila, about who Jose Cuervo was and how he had built this empire, people didn't have answers. They had maybe some scattered stories, but they didn't have a detailed account of his life. And I guess I got curious enough that I found myself trying to go and piece together some bit of that story. I didn't intend when I set out to spend 12 years doing this, but it was a really amazing journey, and I'm really glad that I did. I mean, I think of this book in many ways as being like my proudest achievement as a writer. That, I mean, it took so much work to put all of this together, but every step of the way was so rewarding, and the story that emerged is, to me, really a meaningful one.
Why is there such a information gap from that time that you mentioned, late 19th century, early 20th century? Why is that missing?
So I think one reason is just sort of a physical reality that that during the Mexican Revolution, a lot of records were destroyed. And Tequila and Guadalajara were two places that very specifically saw this kind of destruction. Tequila was burned four different times in a period of just a couple of years in the middle of the revolution. Guadalajara was burned five times. And to me, as a sort of lover of history and especially a lover of archives, these accounts of records being brought out onto the plazas and set on fire in huge bonfires is heartbreaking, because that's all of that history and those records just literally going up in smoke. But the other thing that came out of that is that the reason that these fires were being set was to destroy record of provisional governments and revolutionary movements, and to protect the people who might potentially face prosecution for their activities, either business or political. And Jose Cuervo himself was a great example of that exact danger. That Cuervo, in the middle of the revolution, was arrested. He was tried as an enemy of the revolution by the provisional government of Venustiano Carranza. Cuervo, I mean, the evidence against him was a pair of letters that he had sent to a nephew of his who was a lieutenant colonel in the Federal Army, telling him that he could encamp his soldiers on one of his properties and that he could have use of his horse. There was tremendous danger that came from putting anything on paper, even writing to your nephew and saying, feel free to use my horse while you're on this property, was enough that you could potentially be standing trial as an enemy of the state. After the revolution, people were very, very cautious about putting anything on paper. They were certainly cautious about, maintaining records that might be used against them later on. It's not all that surprising that it was difficult for historians to put together that story, and especially in a environment in Mexico where it was not always the best for academics even to be working on some of these histories. And so the histories that have been written tend to be focused on land records and focused on business production and sort of the large scale trajectory of the tequila industry. But there was nothing written about the individuals, nothing about who they were as people. the question that I had in my own mind was, would it be possible to do this? Would it be possible to not just talk about, what the annual sales of Cuervo were versus Sauza, but to get to know these historical figures as people. And it took a very long time, but through scattered archival resources, through materials that are, in private archives and in little seen writings, it was possible very, very, very slowly to put it all together. Um, and I can only say I don't know what it says about my personality, but I never lost interest in this to very slowly piecing together this picture and getting to understand what was going on. It just always held my interest.
We think we live in tumultuous times. We really
Right.
do. But give us really an idea, especially for the people who watch this channel and who listen. Tell us how crazy the chaos was in Mexico and in the US at the time that this story looks at. The family, the world of tequila, and how they navigated this.
Jose Cuervo was born in 1869, which means that he was a child at the time that Porfirio Diaz came to power, and came to power through military coup. Something that I had absolutely no idea about going into this. And I just don't think it's well documented at all. But Jose Cuervo's uncle, Florentino Cuervo, turns out to have been instrumental in this uprising that was led by Diaz, and essentially was the number two in that uprising. Diaz was organizing his troops in Oaxaca and moving to the north toward Mexico City. Florentino was in the area around Guadalajara and securing the western part of the country. Right from the beginning of his life as a child, Jose Cuervo and his family are embroiled in this major military uprising that then brings Diaz to the presidency and to power, which he then decides that he's going to try to hold on to, at first through proxies and later just by simply declaring himself the perpetual president. Cuervo's uncle, feeling betrayed by that, ends up in conflict with the president, and so there's this throughout Jose Cuervo's childhood. There's this environment where his family is interacting very directly with the perpetual president of the country, sometimes on his good side, sometimes on his bad side, and trying to navigate the politics of all of that. When eventually Diaz uh, decides that he's going to step down from power and essentially kicks off the revolution in that way, Jose Cuervo by that point is in his 20s. He's in his 30s. He sees all of this as a threat to the stability of the country, and initially continues his family's tradition of supporting the president. But then it becomes untenable. I mean, there's not only does Diaz himself like literally leave the country and just leave all of that behind, but then the transition to new leadership is incredibly rocky and is interrupted through assassination with the help of the US government of Francisco Madero. And then all bets are off for the whole country as various military leaders try to stake out different parts of the country. For Jose Cuervo, I mean, he had spent the first decade that he was running the company, from 1900 to about 1910, 1911. He's building all this infrastructure. He's trying to modernize and transform the industry. He's patenting new ovens and new stills. He's having the railroad built to Tequila and getting electricity brought. And when there's not enough power for the electricity, he's participating in a hydroelectric dam project at Lake Chapala. And he's this kind of classic industrialist. But then when the revolution arrives, he spends the last decade of his life trying his best to just defend all of those projects that he's created and to keep his business alive and eventually just to keep his family alive and to keep himself alive. And so it becomes this story of simple survival, which he not only manages to do, but as you said, he comes out on top. His company is one of a few that survived the revolution, and through his sort of vision for what a post-revolutionary Mexico could be and post-revolutionary industry for the tequila industry, the company not only survives but thrives to the present, really through the decisions that he was making, and he didn't live to see them himself, but set the course for his family and for the business.
I told you before we started rolling that I had to read this twice. And in my mind, the way I like to put things together, I said, this is Succession,
Mhm.
The Godfather, Game of
Right.
Thrones, um,
Yep.
Yellowstone.
Yep.
Um, Mix it with some tequila, lime, and salt, and you've got this book because it really is. This isn't just a book, Ted. This is a mini series.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope
This
you're
is a
right.
mini series. There's just so much going on, and it's not just, the political ups and downs. It for people who haven't read the book, this is an absolute roller coaster. The way you put it, the Cuervo family has to play with whoever's on top, and
Yep.
then maybe whoever's on top isn't on top anymore. So
That's
now
right.
they're treated as the enemy by whoever comes in, and then they've got to, and it's just a spider web of
Yes.
alliances, betrayals. And when I first heard that an American journalist had written this deep, multi-generational story about tequila, I said, I wonder what his connection is.
Right.
Because it's not every day that you see someone without an obvious cultural tie to Mexico,
Right.
to go this deep into something that's so rooted, not just into, the story of a spirit, but Mexican identity. But you do have a connection. Tell us about your connection.
So, so my dad is a bat biologist, which may seem like an improbable way of starting to explain this connection. But in the years before I was born, he was working specifically on the bats of Jalisco, the state that where Guadalajara and tequila are. And so he spent years and years, right before I was born, and published just after I was born, a pamphlet that was called "The Bats of Jalisco." And so when I was a kid, all of the Mexican biologists that he had worked with would come and visit us periodically when there were conferences, when he was, by the time I was 4 or 5 years old, he was working at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, which had an international scientist exchange program. So he brought a number of them to come and visit us. And of course, all the guys that you've met while setting bat nets in the agave fields around tequila, they bring a bottle of tequila with them when they come to visit. And I heard these guys telling these stories, and this was a place that I just always wanted to see. And I thought, I truly, like, it seems sort of naive now in retrospect, but I thought that it would be enough to just go do a magazine story. And I pitched this idea actually of, doing something about the industry trying to be more sustainable and focusing on conservation of bats and other pollinators, that there was a kind of way in with my own connection there. And I got to I got to Tequila and then started to going to some of the other surrounding towns, and I just was in love with the place instantaneously. And And at first I was like, well, what I'll do is some more magazine stories. That'll be enough. And then I was like, maybe I'll do a book, but it'll be a kind of, it'll be a light book about the industry now and kind of an introduction. But the thing that just kept happening was that everywhere when I would visit these small artisanal producers and would ask them, about some of these questions of sustainability, like, well, what did your ancestors do? What did your grandfather do? They didn't really have a lot of answers, and they were the ones who were the first to tell me that they're like, "Well, that history is really lost, and it's lost because of the revolution. It's lost because of the caution after the revolution." And so they said with a great deal of regret that the history just was inaccessible, and what they had was tradition and some stories, but they just didn't know the actual history. From the very beginning, this project for me became not only one of trying to recover that history for myself and satisfy my own curiosity, but wanting to be able to deliver that history back to some of the people who had shown me such hospitality and had been, so hospitable to my dad decades ago. And, it means maybe more to me than anything that's happened in this whole process so far, that the book, the rights have been sold for a Spanish language edition. It'll be brought out in Mexico by Penguin Random House Mexico. I'm thrilled for that. I'm thrilled that this book will be available in Spanish for people who are in the region, who have spent their whole lives there wondering about this history, that this will be accessible to them. I'm also hoping, I'm working with some of the brands right now on trying to coordinate a project that will get some of the records that do exist in private for them to be conserved and to be digitized, and so that other scholars, and especially scholars from within Mexico, can access those materials and can build on this history and keep making it more nuanced and rich and detailed. And so that's my ambition, is that this is really just a starting point for an ongoing project of recovering that history.
This book isn't just a story about the Cuervo brand or the family, because that would have been, marketing, you know.
Right, right.
But it's such an in-depth look into the relationships of the people in the families and of the other distillers and their connections. But it's also a super hyper realistic in-depth look at the Mexican Revolution. All of the superstars of the revolution are in there. It's Carranza, Huerta, Villa, Zapata, and millions of others. Woodrow Wilson over on the other side.
Yes,
I had no idea how involved. Then you've got Prohibition,
right.
playing its part. Did you ever feel like you were writing two books at the same time?
Yeah, I did. And it's a great question. And it's a really it so I mean the typical way of approaching a book like this is that you say, well, I'm gonna write this thread that is woven into an existing history. And and so say I'm going to take the tequila industry and look at José Cuervo, look at the Zenobio Sousa and his sons, but there will be this backdrop of Mexican history that's already well established. Unfortunately for me, the revolution and its history is still really only starting to be written in the Mexican literature. And so, for example, somebody like Porfirio Diaz, who generated or received something like 1.5 million pieces of correspondence in the nearly 30 years that he was in office. The project of trying to catalog and digitize that material has just begun. And I mean, this is a figure who is arguably, just the central figure in Mexican history. And if you want to know what Diaz had to say about anything, you've got to wade through more than 1 million documents to try to find the appropriate pieces. That even trying to tell the story of Guadalajara during the revolution, not a lot that has been written about that. And everything was going to primary sources. Everything was working from sort of the ground up on all of this. And it did feel like working on several projects at the same time, because it was like, okay, this is great that we've kind of identified here are the warring sides. And like you said, you get the major figures. But as Obregón is closing in on the tequila region, the people who are actually doing the fighting and collecting materials for his army, somebody like Julian Medina, who is a major figure in a lot of ways, and his second in command at the time, Enrique Estrada, who's an even more significant figure. These are really, really important figures in Mexican history. There's been hardly anything written about them. Everything was starting from the ground up. To answer your question, it often felt like writing and researching multiple books at the same time. Um, what I can say is that the thrill that comes from that is this sort of strange experience of places where really disparate research items will suddenly sort of overlap and match, and that you get this sense of like, I'm on to something. For example, there's in the private archive of the Sauza family, there are records of indigenous farmers who were displaced by Zenobio Sauza. There are also records of complaints after the revolution brought by the same people that are in an archive at the municipal waterworks in Guadalajara, where those same people are then registering with the government and giving detail on how that land was taken from them back in the 1880s. And you really need both sets of records for this all to make sense. They are far apart. I found them 6 years apart. But among the people who were displaced by Zenobio Sauza in that way was Cleophas Mota, who becomes one of the leaders of the revolutionary movement in Tequila. And not only that, but he is organized together with Leopoldo Leal, who was a worker for Zenobio Sauza and was fired by Sauza after he lost his arm in an accident in the distillery. And you can see, well, here are two men who had these deep grudges against Zenobio Sauza, that these are their reasons for entering the revolution. And when they start the revolutionary movement, the first thing that they do is go and occupy and seize the properties where they had worked and where they had been wronged, and did so with the assistance of the Cuervos. And so those pieces, when all of them come together, that, like you said, that kind of web work of interconnections, when it suddenly becomes apparent and you can see how one thing touching the web, that becomes the thrilling part, both in the research and in the storytelling of like, okay, this gives us something where we understand not just the events that are happening, but the motives behind it, what it is that drives someone. And someone like Cleophas Mota or Leopoldo Leal, they become so compelling to me when we know that they've nursed this grudge against the Sauza family for 15 or 20 years. And when they finally get the opportunity to strike back, they take it.
When you mention these grudges and these vendettas and these family feuds, these
Yeah,
Hatfield McCoy situations, that's what reminded me of the Godfather, the crime families. But how does the word cartel figure into the Cuervo story? Because it
right.
does.
Yes, it
And
does.
how is it different, if at all, from how it's used today?
Well, so this was maybe the sort of central revelation of this whole project was that at the peak of the revolutionary chaos in Jalisco, the tequila makers all end up going into hiding together and end up in a kind of small enclave of adobe buildings that are in fairly near to Tequila, but at the bottom of a barranca that's very well protected and a kind of natural fortress. While they are there, Tequila is being repeatedly destroyed, but so are their fields in the surrounding area. So Jose Cuervo proposes this idea to his fellow tequila makers of like, we basically have to stop being competitors for a time. We've got to form a collective body so that, you know, the Sauzas distillery, for example, have been burned almost to the ground. So you can't distill right now, but you do have agave fields. My agave fields have been seized, but my distillery can be repaired. And so we're going to pool our resources and work together and essentially be one company. The idea for this and the word for it came from Cuervo's nephew, who was the German consul in Guadalajara. And the Germans were at that moment preparing for World War One, and they were forming these sort of complex monopolies that they were trying to establish in order to avoid wartime disruptions. And in fact, some of the situation in Mexico was part of this. That they had iron mines that they were developing in Mexico and wanted to be able to be sure that they had enough iron and to produce steel for weapons and during the war. But then if you're going to have an iron mine, you have to also control the railroads. You have to control the shipping routes and this sort of thing. And so the German word for this kind of syndicate is cartel. And Cuervo was arguing to his fellow tequila makers, we need to take this idea of the cartel and import it to our situation here. Yes, we need to pool all of our resources just to get the tequila produced. We need to not be trying to compete with each other, but just carving up territory. And eventually they drew up an actual cartel agreement where they said this is what everybody will contribute. The product will be produced and sold collectively. Will the distribution channels were all Cuervos, and so they used his distributor, but then they carved up territory. They had, you know, this part that would belong to the Sauzas, this part that would belong to the Rosales family behind Herradura, this part belongs to the Cuervos, but we're all going to share the profits equally. And so that does sound quite a lot like the cartel system that we think of today. It all was perfectly legal at that point. Where things started to get into the gray market is that because of Cuervo's close relationship to his German nephew, the US, when it entered into World War One, put Jose Cuervo as his company, all of his distributors, his nephews, all of them onto a list of enemies of the United States. So when that distributor and Cuervo himself and everyone associated with the company is suddenly, you know, blacklisted, the only choice was to move the product as close as they could to the border and then let smugglers do their thing. And that is exactly what they did. And that was how Cuervo envisioned rebuilding the industry. He actually recognized that having the product barred from entrance into the US and then after the end of World War One, having prohibition go in, barring all liquor sales and sales of alcohol of any kind, that this meant that their product was much, much more valuable than it had been before. At the end of this cartel agreement, in 1920, in the fall of 1920. By that point, prohibition is in place and this carved up territory exists. And you essentially see that the Sauzas have the east of Mexico and especially along the Texas border. The Cuervos have Arizona and California, and are really focused on Tijuana. That these become the sort of two competing spaces where there's a lot of product that's moved to these border towns, and some of it, I mean, Tijuana is a great example where there's a racetrack and there are huge hotels and resort facilities, and so there's a very much a sort of legitimate front to all of this, that you can come across the border and these things are all legal. But there's also an understanding that they're selling huge quantities of this product to distributors who are very definitely bringing it across the border. So it becomes this kind of gray market where the cartel system then is really feeding into this smuggling operation. So that and the sort of strange and remarkable coda to all of that is that once the U.S. repeals prohibition, it's almost no time before the Narcotics Act is passed. And so all of those old smuggling routes very quickly just get repurposed. And in fact, the founder of the Gulf Cartel, which is still one of the largest narco cartels in Mexico, was founded by someone who had been a smuggler for the Sauzas in Tamaulipas.
Jose Cuervo, Johnny Walker, Jack Daniels, whatever these brand names are, that's exactly what they were for me. And then you find out, okay, there was a guy. All right, so there was a guy.
Right.
But I mean, in your book, you go into hyper deep detail about the Cuervo family and, what they were like, how they treated each other. What kind of access did you have and how did you get it?
Yeah. So one of the absolute key pieces, no question, was discovering that Jose Cuervo's niece, Guadalupe Gallardo, who had lived with the Cuervos from the time she was about 6 years old until she was into her 20s. She, first of all, was an avid diary keeper, all through, and she in late life, she said that on her birthdays, the only thing that she ever wanted, the only thing she ever asked for was more notebooks and pens. And so at the end of her life, when she had control of the Cuervo company that she had inherited from her aunt and uncle, one of the things that she did with this wealth that she had was that she gathered a number of these writings together and published them in small editions that she shared with family members. Thankfully, a few of those copies made their way into libraries. And so I I'd seen mention of her writings in some of the literature about the tequila industry, but in talking to the scholars, what the sort of initial warning was just like these writings are really difficult to kind of untangle. They're very, very impressionistic writings. Um, but also, she's not to be trusted when it comes to dates and all of this sort of thing. They were like, this is all just working from memory. And so, if you're in the 1950s, remembering something that happened when you were a child in 1904, yes, the things are the sequence of events is sometimes a little off, the dates are sometimes a little off. But what I found was always spot on was her eye for detail and the way that she just sort of remembered particular things with this amazing specificity. And so on the one hand, it could be kind of confounding that, and I understand why people were frustrated that, like, when she talks about her uncle, when she talks about Jose Cuervo getting Manuel Cuesta Gallardo elected governor, and then he is himself appointed to be the Speaker of the House, and they essentially now control the government in Jalisco. And it's this big kind of political achievement for them. The thing that she talks about in great detail is the sort of grand ball that was held to celebrate this. And she talks about her aunt's dress in great detail. She talks about, who the guests were and but what Lupe's writings give us is exactly what you're saying. This sense of what is the dynamic among the people? What is the dynamic in the room behind closed doors that the newspapers and other public writings didn't have access to? And, in that particular night, the thing that I always go back to is Manuel Cuesta Gallardo when he arrives and there's applause for him having been elected, that he goes up to Ana Gonzalez Rubio, to Jose Cuervo's wife, and offers his arm and walks her around in a circuit around the room. And that Lupe explains that this was a kind of tradition for honoring women who were older and married, and that it was considered, unseemly for them to dance at this point. But it was a way of specifically acknowledging the way that some of the social connections that she had helped make and the political alliances that she had helped forge in that way were crucial to his election. Those sorts of details that Lupe provides are the things that breathe life into the whole book for me. That she's, to me, she's like the crucial source of all of these materials. And then the other is just the scant places where it was possible to get hold of letters, some of which are in the Sauza family archives, some of which Cuervo family members still have. And having a little bit that comes from the immediacy of the correspondence in a moment that just allows us to see what the behind the scenes conversations are. That was always the objective. It's like, how do we get as close as possible to the people themselves and what they're thinking and doing, away from the view of the newspapers and the sort of official reports.
But she did have power. Um,
Yes.
and in a world and a time that's dominated by, especially back then, this Mexican sense of machismo, you know, how did the women of the time, especially the Cuervo women, how did they figure into the story of the companies and of what was going on in the revolution?
Yeah, that's a great question because again, the Cuervo women especially were incredibly influential and powerful, and part of that is that this fascinating relationship, this marriage between Jose Cuervo and Ana Gonzalez Rubio, that Ana was always very, very outgoing, very kind of confident, and by all accounts, this great conversationalist, and Jose Cuervo had this great mind for business, but by all accounts was extremely shy and soft-spoken and sort of reluctant to speak. He understood, what sort of moves needed to be made in terms of like, well, if we need to have the railroad, we're going to have these kinds of concessions. We need to talk to these people in the federal government or these people within the companies that have gotten a concession from the federal government. But then Anna would be the person who would start to work the personal connections, who would have a party to invite the appropriate people, who would strike up the conversations. And in some cases, I mean, there were nieces that were married to the appropriate people in order to forge these alliances. And so the Southern Pacific agent is suddenly married to a Cuervo niece, and the Southern Pacific Railroad then agrees that the line will run through Tequila, and so on. And so we see this sort of behind the scenes influence that Anna wielded, but also because Lupe had such a close relationship with Anna, we see into the sort of the world of women in general, and how they were often quite powerful in certain ways, but then in moments like the revolution found themselves suddenly utterly powerless if their husbands were arrested, for example. I mean, the former governor's brother who lived across the street from the Cuervos, Joaquin Cuesta Gallardo, when the police came and arrested him, and his wife is utterly powerless to stop them, and has to rely on other people to take pity on her, to even let her know that he was executed and where he was buried. And so it it is, to me, this fascinating lens into this world where women like Anna were incredibly powerful, and in other ways their 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 power and influence was tied to their husbands. And Anna becomes, to me, a fascinating figure, that after Jose Cuervo dies, that she continues to run the company, keeps manages to fend off some of Jose's brothers who wanted to take over the company. And when prohibition is repealed in the U.S., she's the one who is on the applications for all of the original export permits, and to register the name in the United States. And Cuervo, as we know it in the U.S., was established, by Ana, and then was run by Lupe after Ana died. And so it the presence of women is really crucial in that portion of the company's history from the 1920s through the 1950s. So yeah, I mean, I think that they're a fascinating group. And it's frustrating to me. I mean, Lupe's writings yield so much, but she wrote nothing about her time running the company, wrote nothing about, how that transition occurred. And so that part of the story, at least from her perspective, just isn't known, at least at the moment.
We usually assume that these empires, were, as you said in the beginning, formed and were run linearly. To give people who are watching a true idea, how close was the entire tequila industry to just not existing?
Really close. I mean, really close during the revolution, for sure. There's a moment in 1919 when the industry is essentially coming back into a period of paying taxes, and that the government is organized enough to be able to collect those taxes, and the land records are being negotiated coming out of the revolution. At that moment, the town of Tequila itself had diminished to fewer than 3,000 people. And, these are large Catholic families. The estimate in the census that was taken was that it was around 150 families. And at that time, there were four functioning distilleries after there having been, hundreds of them. And they are essentially split between the Cuervo and Sauza families. There's the two Cuervo owned distilleries, and then there's the Sauza distillery, and the one that was owned by some of the Sauza in-laws. There were others that eventually got back into production as the economy recovered, and as workers returned, and it was possible to get them going. Herradura being a prime example of that they really got going in the 1920s. But there was a moment in time where, if the Cuervo and Sauza families had not managed to pass through that bottleneck, that I think tequila as an industry and as a spirit would have just ceased to exist.
What was Jose Cuervo's role in helping to turn that around, and what innovations did he bring, or did he that he took from when he got the company to when he died? What kind of innovations was he responsible for?
Yeah, so the thing that I think is fascinating, that like in the first half, it's all sort of like technical innovations, right? That it's, there a steam oven that is one of his cousins helps to develop, and the still that his brother patents. And so sort of new distillation technology and the railroads and the electricity and and all of the stuff too around individual bottling and sort of doing that in a more just industrial way. The innovations of the second half, and especially the innovations at the end of his life, to my mind, are really more about like the culture of the industry and seeing business opportunities. And maybe the most remarkable of those to me is that when the U.S. passed the Volstead Act to enact prohibition, it was aimed at trying to have it so that that it would be able to go into effect right at the start of 1920. But the ratification was a little bit slow, and it meant that prohibition would actually start in the middle of January 1920, and that wartime prohibition would elapse at the end of 1919. So Cuervo recognizes there's a window where it's legal, and it's only it's something like 17 days that were guaranteed. They thought that there might be another week that they would repeal a wartime prohibition early so that people could have a drink over Christmas. But Cuervo was like, this is our shot. Like we can sell a ton of tequila across the border, but we've got to get all of our distilleries up and running. We've got to get everything into maximum production. We've got to get the railroads running so that we can move things. And so there's this grand effort that is made at the end of 1919 in order to get all these distilleries up and running again, and to move massive amounts of tequila across the border. It's so indicative of how opportunistic Cuervo's business sense often was, that he's playing defense, just trying to keep the company running, trying to keep everything from being destroyed. But then any moment that there was just a little sliver of daylight, he was exploiting that opportunity. Maybe my favorite moment in all of his sort of correspondence and that history of that period, there's a place where Cuervo essentially goes dark for almost 2 years. The destruction, especially Pancho Villa's destruction of Guadalajara and surrounding areas, is just making it impossible to move tequila. And so Cuervo writes in early 1915 to the government saying, I'm shutting everything down, that he's been asked to give a report on what their production has been for the previous year and what they expect it to be. And it's this kind of despondent letter of like, our daily labors are destroyed by government forces, and so we're shutting everything down. But when he shut down La Rojena, and he himself went to Mexico City, the barrels that were in the barrel room, holding the tequila that was going to go to market, sat there for a while, 2 years, 3 years. When he came back and got the business up and running again, there's this letter that he sends out to his distributors saying, great news, there's a new product that we're introducing, and it's tequila añejo. This is as good as the finer cognacs. We're going to charge 4 times as much for this as we charge for the Blanco. And you can practically see him returning to the distillery, getting everything opened again, opening the barrels and being like, oh, all of that inventory that had been sitting there, not producing a profit for them for years, suddenly becomes one of the mechanisms that allows them to sort of get up and running again. And there's a recognition too that Americans who are used to drinking whiskey and this barrel aged spirit, that in particular appeals to American drinkers, and that becomes something to kind of push toward that border traffic as well. So I love that opportunistic mind, that way of seeing that every setback may possibly be an opportunity if you can make or if you can take advantage of it before your competitors do.
What is your relationship like with the drink today?
Mhm.
And what's one thing that you think would make a surface tequila fan drop their glass in disbelief about tequila?
So I love the spirit for all kinds of reasons. Um, One of them for me is that the spirit is a category. Tequila is so variable that the tequila that's produced in the highlands doesn't taste the same as the tequila that's produced in the valley. That the products that are made at neighboring distilleries taste quite different from each other. And the way that each brand has its own kind of characteristic and its own history, this profile that it's looking for, the specific drinker that it's trying to reach. I love all of that. I and it's funny, people often ask, they're like, well, what's your favorite tequila? And I'm like, I don't even know how I could start to answer that because for me it is so connected to particular experiences and particular moments in time. I mean, just recently, doing some of the promotion for this book, I was in the barrel room at La Rojena. Part of the experience there is that you can drink the barrel proof, so it's over 50% alcohol, that of the extra añejo that's coming straight out of the barrel in there. What I had just been talking about was I was talking to a reporter there, talking about the barrel room, talking about Cuervo having used that very space to hide weapons, to protect the distillery, talking about the story of the añejo and how that had been created in the space that we were standing in. To then, in that moment, be able to dip the sampler into one of these barrels and bring it out and taste what's still being produced in that space of more than a century later, that's a sort of sensory experience that's never going to leave me. And that's what I love most about the spirit, is how it is a kind of bottled moment that you can keep with you, but you can only keep it with you for a while. I mean, I also love the fact that the name spirit is well chosen, that you it is something that you can sort of bottle, you can transport, but you can't keep it forever. It disappears on its own if you try to keep it too long. You have to uncork it, you have to drink it, you have to share it with your friends, and you have to tell those stories, just exactly as my dad and his friends did when I was a kid. You open it, you taste it, you remember the first time that you experience some of these flavors, you pass that on to someone else. And that's what I love about this whole the whole tequila experience, is being able to feel a part of that tradition and then to share it with some other people. I guess the thing that surprises me, um, and I just kind of find moving, is related to what I was just saying, that there are these particular flavors now that are part of my memories of this place. And I guess I've always thought of myself as a very sort of visual person. My memories are primarily remembering things that I've seen, and moments that seem sort of like a snapshot in my mind. Because of this tequila experience, I think I've developed this other kind of sense memory that is related very much to odor and to flavor. And so now when I think of tequila, when I think of the town of Tequila, I think of that sort of honeyed molasses smell of baking agave that pervades the town, especially at morning and night when they're opening the ovens. Um, I I think of the the various people that I've gone and interviewed and all of the tequilas that they have shared with me, and I have memories of stories that were told to me or documents that were shared with me that that match a flavor of a tequila that we were drinking. And because those tequilas are produced by those families, it is this kind of way in which the flavors and the stories are one in my memory. My hope would be that my enthusiasm for that, my deep love for that, is something that I can share in a way that it gets other people to participate in that. And I hope that people will not only uh, drink tequila, but will go visit tequila to see the place for themselves. It is really a world treasure. I love it there.
Friends, the name of the book is Tequila Wars, José Cuervo and the Bloody Struggle for the Spirit of Mexico. Before I forget, because this one was a strong one, I've got links in the description for you, so you can go ahead and pick up a copy. Ted, you've pulled back the curtain in a lot of ways, a curtain that didn't exist. There's not even a curtain to a lot of these stories to pull back, but you dug up things that I will be eternally grateful for learning. For me, as soon as I heard history and tequila, I said, I've got to talk to this guy. So Ted
Well,
Genoways, I have nothing but to say gracias, mil gracias. Friends, support great journalism, support history, and as always, thanks so much, Ted, and thanks for watching The Mysteries of Latin America. Mil gracias, Ted.
thank you so much. Thanks for having me.